Well, thank you again for joining us today for our learning community on the foundations of data equity. Our guest presenter today is Heather Krause, PSTAT, an award-winning data scientist who specializes in data sourcing, modeling, and data storytelling. But who needs me to introduce her when the guest of honor herself is here? Heather, please take it away.
Hi, thank you so much, Tamika. I really appreciate it. And I want to take a minute before I introduce myself just to say thank you so much to Tamika, Kimberly, and Betsy, and all the other people that have invited me and helped organize my presence today. And it's so exciting to get to talk to a group like this, living through a time like this in a place like this. It is, there's some real challenges happening and so many opportunities that we can work together on. So thank you so much for having me. It really means a lot that you think it might be useful. Yeah, so I'm actually going to introduce myself with a slide or two. So I'll just share my slides. And I absolutely love data. And I remember so distinctly the moment that I fell in love with data. And I was a high school student living in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. And I had been working for 2 summers in the downtown core of Harrisburg on a community, kind of a community project to help with income inequality and poverty reduction. And the second summer I was there, some guy showed up from Penn State University with a clipboard and a whole bunch of pieces of papers and a pen. And he was asking all these questions of me and of people I was working with and people that were experiencing poverty. And then he just kind of went away and came back about 6 weeks later with all of this data and all of this research and all these outcomes from the survey he had taken, and talked to us about all these trends that he saw that were happening in the work that we were doing, that even though we were on the ground, we weren't seeing this work. And I mean, we were seeing those trends. And the trends that he showed us kind of brought to life so many things that had been hidden to us before. Like it kind of cut through like the religious issues that were happening in Harrisburg at the time, and the race issues that were happening in Pennsylvania, and the class issues. And he really used this data to help us see what was happening. And I thought, that is exactly what I want to do. I want to use data to kind of cut through any ideas that are kind of fuzzing up our access to see what's really going on and how to move the ball in the direction that we're trying to move the ball, which in our case was poverty reduction. And so I decided right then and there, that's what I was going to do. And sure enough, I did that. This guy was from Penn State, and I ended up going to Penn State to get a degree in computer science and math. And then I did a whole bunch of graduate work and postgraduate work and stuff, all in statistics and math and computer programming, and just fell in love with data, and really was ready to go out of grad school to help use data to kind of, make the world a better place. And got out of grad school, right onto the ground, and realized that data is not objective. And that while I still believe in data very much, the idea that it has no point of view, or that it doesn't reflect a set of values, and it kind of can cut through any ism and just immediately tell us the truth, is not quite the way that we think it is. And the place that really taught me this was where I worked right out of grad school, which was rural Bangladesh, where I was using data to try and understand if some projects that different groups were doing that were designed to help women get more milk from their cows, if those were working. And we were collecting that data in pictures and stickers and images, because a lot of those people couldn't read. So we used images, and it just really brought home to me how, like, what I think of as raw data at that time, which was like a kind of a messy Excel spreadsheet, is so many layers and steps removed from what the data is actually measuring, that by the time something gets into a spreadsheet, so many people have made choices and decisions about what to count and how to count it and how to add it up and how to aggregate it, that it really has a lot of people's ideas embedded into it. And so we need to find ways to understand how that works and how that impacts our data and our outcomes, and make sure that the people who are contributing the data, that their lived experiences and worldviews are embedded and included in the way that we make sense and tell stories with their data, which isn't easy to do if you're really hooked into this idea that data is objective. So when we talk about bias in math, what we mean is systematic error that introduces or encourages one outcome over the other. That's the mathematical meaning of the word bias. And what that means in reality is that in the whole life cycle of a data project, there's all kinds of choices where we either knowingly or unknowingly or accidentally or intentionally embed worldviews and priorities and values into the data projects that we're working on. Usually it's a combination of habits and intent and accident and just a muddy combination of things, but it definitely happens. Even basic math has a worldview embedded into it. And it's really important to understand this as people that work in education and people that want to use data to help understand how to make our educational system the best possible thing it can be. And there's so much data in the educational system. I work a lot with different levels of educators and practitioners and parents and policymakers. And I run a company called We All Count, which is a project that is dedicated to understanding how to build tools that make sure that equity is embedded into data projects. And we use these tools in the United Nations High Commission for Refugees and in local school districts and school boards and tiny little nonprofits and big corporations like MasterCard and Volkswagen and stuff like that. But the education sector is a real passion of mine because there's so much very useful data like student access data, participation and completion data, student survey data, funding data, spending data. That's just scratching the surface of the amount of data that y'all have. And these data are used in so many different ways. And if we could get together and align around some actual tools to embed equity into this data analysis and its communication, whether it's for continuous improvement, to understand campus climate, to promote student success and achievement, that would ensure that we are not, that we are including the perspectives and the lived experiences that we are intending to include in our data projects, in our reports, in our analyses, in our dashboards, in our KPIs. And what do I mean when I say embedding the lived experience into data? That seems weird or impossible. So I'm going to walk you through a short story that involves something that we talk about a lot in education, which is what is the average classroom size in this school? So don't answer out loud, just think to yourself right now. This school has 3 classrooms. The first classroom has 1 student. The second classroom has 3 students. And the third classroom has 5 students. So what is the average classroom size in this school? Again, don't answer out loud, just do it to yourself. So if you said that the average classroom size is 3 students per class, you are correct. However, if you said that the average classroom size is 4 students per class, you are also correct. So how is it possible to look at 3 simple classrooms one school, 3 simple classrooms, and have both the answer 3 and 4 be correct answers. And the way that this is possible is that it depends on whose lived experience you're embedding. It depends on who you ask. So we're going to walk through the math, and don't worry, this is as mathy as this gets. Or this is not a math lesson. This is as technical as we're going to get. So we go into the first classroom and we say to the teacher, how many students are in your classroom? That teacher says there's 1. Then we go into the second classroom and we say to that teacher, how many students are in your classroom? That teacher says there's 3. Then we go into the third classroom and we say, how many students are in your classroom? And that teacher says 5. This is the way many people take an average when asked at first. Then they add the 1, the 3, and the 5, and you get 9. And you divide by the 3 perspectives and you get 3. So 1 plus 3 plus 5 divided by 3 equals 3. And that's the way that a lot of people do the math when asked the question the first time. And that's a correct answer, and that embeds the perspective of the teacher. However, if your educational research or your report is trying to understand how something affects students, how a curriculum or a pedagogy or a new project or a new school platform affects students, you might want to embed the student's perspective. So how do we do that? This is exactly the same way. We go into classroom number 1 and we ask that student, how many students are in your classroom? And that student says 1. Second classroom, we ask the first student, how many students are in your classroom? That student says 3. The next student also correctly looks around the classroom, says there's 3 students. The student also correctly says there's 3 students in my classroom. Then we go to the final classroom and we ask this student, how many students are in your classroom? This person says 5 students in my classroom. This student also says 5 students in my classroom. These students also correctly say 5 students in my classroom. Then we do the math. We take the average in the same way. We add up all the answers, 1 plus 3 plus 3 plus 3 plus 5 plus 5 plus 5 plus 5 plus 5 equals 35. We divide by the number of perspectives, which is 9, and we get 4. So the average classroom size is either 3 students per class or 4 students per class, depending on who you ask. So the answer to the question, what is the average classroom size from the lived experience of teachers, is 3. And the average classroom size from the lived experience of students is 4. So even the most basic math in your data project, in your research, has somebody's perspective embedded into it. And one of the important things about this example is that both of the answers are correct. It's not like the answer 3 is the equity-based answer, or the answer 4 is the equity-based answer. Because which is the equity-based answer depends on whose perspective you're trying to answer the question from, or whose lived experience you're trying to embed in your research. Both are correct, but you need to be transparent about whose perspective you're embedding. So when we realize that data is not objective and we're never going to be able to produce even an average classroom size that doesn't have someone's lived experience embedded into it, instead of striving to make our research or our data projects or our reports objective, we need to strive to make them equitable, which is transparent and intentional. So you need to, when you're reporting the average classroom size, say whose lived experience you've embedded. So that's the transparent part. And intentional, choose either the teacher's perspective or the student's perspective based on the purpose of your research and whose perspective you're trying to embed. And in this example, the 3 and the 4 and the average size is very, very close together. And I did it that way because I wanted to be able to walk through the math with you and have a very small number of classrooms and students to count out. But if this was a school that had like 20 classrooms, these numbers would be much, much farther apart, and the difference in lived experience would be quite a lot. So this is where we're going to take a break. We're going to go into groups. I think I'm going to turn the group management over to the very talented Betsy. And let's just take a minute to think about how to apply this. What is the most salient difference between the two answers, the 3 students per class and the 4 students per class? Okay, welcome back from your breakout rooms. And we are gonna take just a couple of minutes. I have other things to share, but before I go on, I'm gonna take a couple of minutes to see if anyone wants to share something from their breakout rooms, a summary or something they learned or thought about in their breakout rooms. You can either type it into the chat, or you can unmute yourself and talk, or if that just seems like too much on a Thursday in December, you do not have to. It is entirely optional. I just want to give you a minute. Go ahead.
We had a quick lesson in measures of central tendency and a brief discussion about whether or not we should throw out outliers.
So that's a very good question. Right. So making decisions about outliers is actually a very political decision. How you handle outliers is extremely important for equity, because the people who are often the most marginalized or the least represented are often outliers. And so do you want to include their lived experiences in your data report or not? So that's another important question that we will definitely cover someday. One of the differences here between the teacher's perspective and the student's perspective is the denominator. So if you're ever wondering, like if you're needing to create some descriptive statistics, or if you are consuming some descriptive statistics, if somebody's given you a report to read and you're wondering whose lived experience is embedded in this, one of the clues that you can use to find that out is to look at the denominator. Now, I know most of you are in education, but that doesn't mean you know what a denominator is. Some people do and some people don't. So this fraction, 9 divided by 3, the 9 is called the numerator and the 3 is called the denominator. And so whatever is the denominator in aggregate statistics or descriptive statistics can often give you a clue about who's kind of being centered in this analysis. And in this case, the students are the denominator and they're being centered. And in this case, the teachers are being centered and they're the denominator. So that's one of the clues if you're either creating some analysis or if you're making decisions or building a policy or making plans based on somebody else's analysis. Ask them who the denominator is. If you're using open data or governmental data or any kind of data that tells you the average of anything, the average wait time to get a COVID vaccine, from whose lived experience, because those averages all have denominators. And one of the things we were talking about this over the break is that sometimes you'll hear that this is the difference between a simple average and a weighted average, that the average that's calculated from the teacher's perspective is sometimes considered a simple average, and the average calculated from the student perspective is sometimes considered to be a weighted average. And that might be kind of a habitual way to view this, but in reality, every average is weighted. That's what the denominator is. And we sometimes consider the teacher's perspective to be the quote unquote simple average, but that's only because we are so deeply embedded with the belief that in hierarchical power, that the teacher's perspective is the simple average because that's whose perspective we're so habituated into embedding into our data. And so there's really no difference between a simple average and a weighted average. A simple average means the average that privileges or prioritizes the lived experience of the group that we most assume is the most powerful group. So if somebody tries to tell you that one of those is a simple average and one of those is a weighted average, the truth is they're both weighted averages, as are all weighted averages. So this is just one tiny little example that introduces you to the idea of the data equity framework. So the data equity framework is a tool that was developed by the Project for Equity in Data called We All Count. I'm the founder, but it's a community of people. I'm certainly not the only person. And the data equity framework is designed to address equity issues systematically at each step of a data project. So pretty much data projects across sectors, whether we work in big corporations, we work with big federal governments, and we work with little teeny tiny grassroots organizations and mission-driven, social enterprises. Pretty much every data project goes through the same 7 steps, but the words aren't always the same, the logos and the lingo isn't the same, but the concepts are that pretty much every data project goes through a funding or resource allocation step, a motivation or purpose defining step, a project design step, a data collection or data acquisition or data sourcing step, an analysis step, an interpretation step, and a communication distribution step. And these 7 steps generally reflect the order of kind of the life cycle of a data project, but you can address them at any order. So not every data project is discrete with a simple start and a simple stop. Many are ongoing, many are continuous, there's administrative. And we present them in kind of a specific life cycle, but they certainly don't have to be used or applied in this life cycle. And it's very common for individuals or teams to not really even work at all of the steps of a data project. Some people only work on data collection. Some teams only work in analysis and interpretation. Some teams are responsible for all the steps. And again, that's perfectly fine. The data equity framework has been specifically designed so that you can work with the processes and the checklists and the tools at any step of the framework, any step of the project that you are in right now. And it's both holistic as well as individual, because you can make changes at any individual step, either like really small changes that you can do in a day that don't require any extra resources, or really big changes that require like budgets and strategic plans. And any change you make at one of the steps in the data equity framework is just going to ripple out to all the other steps. So because of that, it's important that you have like a basic overview that there are 7 steps and that they do interact. Today, we are going to talk about the project design step, because I know that many of you either work in that step or consume and have to make decisions based on the outcomes of those steps. And project design has a very, very big role to play in terms of equity and data. And that's because project design is where you operationalize all your ideas and all the different types of choices that you have to make, where the why turns into the how. And it's important to remember in equity-centered projects that project design is about making your project as good as it can be, not protecting it from being a disaster. We have other steps for that. I am a practitioner, I work on the ground. I have had plenty of projects that have been disasters, and I know it's important that they not. But the first part of project design is really about brainstorming, how great can this project be? And one of my very favorite outcomes from a brainstorm session that we've run is this, which is a map that is designed by Native Land Digital, which you can find at nativeland.ca, and I'll make sure everybody gets that link. But essentially, this is a map, a downloadable free map of boundaries that are meaningful to Indigenous people. And the brainstorm of this particular project that we were working on, they wanted to embed the data with the viewpoint of the lived experience of Indigenous people. That was an intention of this project. And they got to display their data using these maps instead of different maps that would have had reflect a different worldview. So brainstorming is a really important first step in the project design phase. And it's really hard to get people into a room and say, please brainstorm, please kind of get outside your normal worldview, get outside your box, and try and think about how you might embed some equity into your data project. So we have a tool called the Perspective Microscope that helps you brainstorm this general structure ideas around 3 key questions. Who is asking the questions? What are the questions? And where are you looking for the answers? So in terms of equity, these are the 3 most important questions of project design. I'm going to give you an example. We were embedded with the Syrian Refugee Resettlement Secretariat, and it was our job to figure out a measurement framework to define how well Syrian refugee resettlement was going. And we didn't want that measurement framework to just say, how well are Syrian refugees starting to adopt all the ideas and customs and attitudes of whatever country they're in, because that's not necessarily a success for a Syrian refugee. So we wanted to get as many ways to get other perspectives into this measurement framework. How are we going to actually think about designing this project? And so what we did was gather together the main project stakeholders and made a list to use in the tool. So we had things like the national government, a local nonprofit, a large foundation, Syrian refugees, and non-refugee city residents. And we make a list of all of these stakeholders, and then we start using the microscope. And the microscope is a tool so that people have something that they can either touch or move around on the whiteboard that actually lets them play with brainstorming. So the top of the microscope is the main lens. Whose point of view, what lens are we asking this question from? The red, the second lens of the microscope, is the motivation question. What do we want to know? And then the bottom is the slide. That's the data. Where might we find some answers? So we got all these people into many different rooms. Of course, this is pre-COVID. People were in rooms. And we put up on the whiteboard the list of the stakeholders and the picture of our microscope. And then you literally just take turns moving different stakeholders into that top perspective, into the lens, and asking the question, okay, if you're asking this secondary focus question, where would you look for data? And what kind of questions would emerge? So we brainstormed hundreds of these ideas because this was a really big project with a lot of stakeholders. But it doesn't have to be. You could brainstorm like a couple or a couple dozen. So when we moved the local nonprofit into the lens through which we were viewing the question, how well is Syrian refugee resettlement going? They said to us, well, we might want to collect data from the Syrian refugees. And we might want to ask questions like, do the refugees have jobs? Are refugee children benefiting from our after-school programs? So this was pretty conventional. This wasn't a kind of a new way to design this project, but that's okay. That's why it's a brainstorm. We want to just get as many ideas onto the table as possible, even if they're not like realistic or possible. We just want to get them onto the table. So at another, further on in the session, we put the Syrian refugees at the top of our microscope and asked the question, okay, from the perspective Looking through the lens of the Syrian refugees, asking the question, how well is Syrian refugee resettlement going? Where might you want to collect data? And they said from the large foundations and our city governments. And they said these might lead to questions like, is the city government providing support in a language we could read? Another part of the brainstorm, we put the large foundation and national nonprofits at the top. So they were kind of working as a coalition to provide support to the Syrian refugees. So we said, okay, from your perspective, when you, the large foundation, are looking through the lens and asking the question, how well is Syrian refugee resettlement going? What are you going to put on the slide? What stakeholder would you like to collect data from? And they said the local nonprofits. And the questions that they might be interested were, how effectively are they, the nonprofits, local, spending the funding that we've supplied to support the Syrian refugees? So you can see how there's no right or wrong here. It's a brainstorm of what does our project design look like when we embed many different perspectives. Another example of when we asked a different group of Syrian refugees, when we look through the microscope using your eyes and ask the question, how well is Syrian refugee resettlement going? Where might you want to collect data? And this group gave a different answer. They said they would want to collect data from their own communities as well as the non-refugee city residents, and ask questions, maybe how socially integrated do we feel our children are, and do our neighbors agree? So this is a short example of a really practical tool. I mean, the Syrian refugees mostly did not speak English. And of course, we had federal government people who speak a very specific, like policy-oriented language, and then nonprofit people who speak like a social service language. And this is a really simple tool where there's no right or wrong answer, and it allows you to brainstorm and get outside the box of how this project might be designed from different perspectives. So another example that we were working on recently with a different group of educators was, how well is Black student retention going? And they had a project where they wanted to understand this. So we did the same thing, make a list of the stakeholders that are involved in this research project. In this case, it included the school administration, a large foundation that was funding this project, state government, of course, local businesses that were very involved in this particular project. The federal government was involved, Black students and non-Black students. Of course, that's a binary list of stakeholders, but you could be as nuanced as you wanted to be. And then in whatever groups are appropriate, you can do a virtual whiteboard, you can do a Google Doc, in whatever constellations are appropriate. You simply put, oh, that's funny. You simply put different stakeholders into the top. And so in this example, if you were looking through the eyes of the large foundation that's funding this project and asking the question, how well is Black student retention going? Where might you look for answers? From what stakeholders might you want to collect data? If you feel like it, you can type some brainstorm ideas into the chat. You don't have to, but just take a minute and let yourself brainstorm. From the point of view of the large foundation, looking at the question, how well is Black student retention going? Where might you collect some data, and what kinds of questions would emerge for you? Would it be, would you want to collect data from the school administration? Would you want to collect data from the Black students? Would you want to collect data from all the students? Where, from the large foundation's perspective, would you want to collect government data? Would you look to the state governments or the federal governments to collect data on them, like the large foundation did in the Syrian refugee example? They wanted the data not from the actual Syrian refugees, but from the local nonprofits. What if you're the federal government and you were wondering, we were looking through your view into asking the question, how well is Black student retention going? Where, through the lived experience and the priorities and the worldview of the federal government, where might you want to look for data? Would you look to the state governments? Would you look to the students? Would you want data on outcomes? Are you looking for outcome like count data? Are you looking for social data like what students do if they aren't in school? Would you want attitudinal data from parents or the business owners that are also involved? There are many, many different ways to collect data and ask specific questions depending on whose point of view you are putting at the top of the microscope. If you're looking at this question through the lens of Black students, wanting to answer the question, how well is Black student retention going? Then where do you think you're going to look for data? Are you going to collect data from the state government? Are you wondering how the finances are going? Are you going to want to collect data from the Black students and the non-Black students? Are you going to wonder what the certain outcomes feel like to different students? Or are you going to wonder, are you going to conduct like a perception survey? There's so many different ways that this can be measured based on whose lived experience you are working from. And the idea during the project microscope is to do as much as possible in terms of just getting as many different project designs, as many different data collection ideas and research question ideas on whiteboards or Post-it notes or Google Docs or whatever you're working in. And then once you've done that, then it's time to narrow everything down, get as broad as possible, and then get as specific as possible. And getting specific as possible involves crafting an equity-based research question. And when you're crafting a research question, this is one of the reasons that project design is so important for embedding equity in your data, because research questions, as we're traditionally taught in our professional development, are often accidentally problematic. So the assessment questions to ask of a research question are, who is the onus to change being put on, and how is success of that change being defined? Those are the two questions that you want to use to assess a research question for equity. Because often extremely well-intentioned researchers, very bright organizations accidentally lack equity in their research questions, not because they're trying to, simply because they haven't been trained to assess them from an equity perspective. So we were working with a high school school district in Texas, and we were helping them design some equity-based research. And the original research question they had was, how can we keep Hispanic boys from being expelled at our school at a higher rate than non-Hispanic boys? Very well-intentioned question. However, if we look at the onus to change as puzzle pieces, how are the different puzzle pieces coming together and fitting together? Right now, we have the high school programs, and we have the non-Hispanic boys, and we have the Hispanic boys as three puzzle pieces. And what we're accidentally doing with this research question is asking the Hispanic boys to kind of change around so that they fit into this high school program and non-Hispanic boys situation over here better. The onus to change is implicitly on the Hispanic boys in this research question. And the definition of success in this research question is experiencing life or behaving or thinking or acting like non-Hispanic boys, which is not usually a great way to set up success from an equity perspective. So instead, we revise the research question and we revise the way that we're actually arranging these puzzle pieces. And instead of only asking the Hispanic boys to change, instead, we're hoping that the high school program puzzle piece is where we're expecting to see change. So the revised research question, what processes in our school are most strongly related to pushing out Hispanic boys? And what school characteristics are most strongly related with creating environments that encourage Hispanic boys to fulfill their pre-existing desire to remain in school? So you can see the difference here. How can we keep Hispanic boys from being expelled from our schools at a higher rate than non-Hispanic boys? Very well-intentioned research question by a smart, good research and evaluation team. However, which puzzle piece are we asking to change here? And what is our definition of a successful change? We rewrite it, we adjust who we're expecting to change and how we're defining success. So what processes in our schools are most strongly related? So what we're looking at, how can we change the processes in the school, not how can we change the Hispanic boys? And what school characteristics are most strongly related with creating environments that encourage Hispanic boys to fulfill their desire to remain in school? So how can we help the Hispanic boys remain most like themselves, fulfill their own potential, rather than start to behave or produce data in a similar way that non-Hispanic boys do? That can seem like a very nuanced or minor difference, but it has a huge impact on the results, for one thing, and on the equity and points of view that are being embedded in the research question, and then by extension into the whole project. And one of the really interesting things that happened in this school district was that before we got there, there was a ton of tension in this school district between different levels of administration, different levels of staff, certainly the research and evaluation team, and of course, also the parents and the students weren't happy with the way that the situation was around student outcomes and discipline, particularly when disaggregated along racial ethnic lines. And what really blew my mind is that the situation in the school district changed dramatically when they changed their research questions. The data didn't change, the outcomes didn't change. By changing their research question, they didn't fix the problems, but they fixed how they were going to study the problems and how they were going to assess the problems. And making that change, even though it didn't fix the problem, it shifted the feeling between the parents and the research teams and the admin and the staff from, we are using data as a weapon to divide people, to point out deficits and assets, stuff, to we are using data as a common point to progress towards our common goal. And so changing this research question made a dramatic difference in the relationships around data in this school before the problem was fixed. So I'm not under the illusion that changing your research question is going to change the problems that exist, but it's going to change the way data is used to address those problems. So I've just given you a very quick insight into what the data equity framework is, and why it's important, and that equity in data is not just kind of a warm and fuzzy idea that we should kind of think about, but it's actually in the heart of every data project. If you're interested, there's no distinction between reliable data projects and equitable data projects. There's no distinction between good data and good science and equitable data and equitable science. They're actually the same thing. And so we have a list of tools and checklists and processes and stories that you can use all the way through the 7 steps: funding, motivation, project design, which we mostly talked about today, data collection and sourcing, analysis, interpretation, and communication and distribution. And this is where you can reach me, but I'll be coming back in a couple of different ways. This weallcount.com is the main project website. So that houses a lot of different case studies and blog posts and tools that you can access. And it has a newsletter that lots of people share their stories in, their successes, their challenges, their resources. This is my email, support@weallcount.com. This is my Twitter, but I'll be frank, I'm old, I'm never on Twitter. So don't direct message me on Twitter, because then you'll feel bad and I'll feel bad because we'll never connect. So if you want to connect, support@weallcount is where to connect. And yes, that's right. So 2 ways that I am going to be back. First way I'm going to be back is that I'm going to come back again in 2021. January 21st, 2021, and we are going to talk about a different part of the data equity framework. We're going to talk about how to collect and analyze demographic data with equity, how to make sense of your data from an equity perspective, and how to tell stories with data equity that people can actually use. So if you found this helpful, that might be helpful to you as well. And secondly, is that we have a private online learning platform that you will all be invited to. It's not a membership platform. This is not an upsell. It is a platform that's on our server that where we will share the slides from this presentation. We'll also share lots and lots of supplemental resources. And there's also places that you can ask questions, and me and other people in the community and the team can answer them. Or you can share tools amongst yourselves. I know you have an extensive network. You can share tools amongst yourselves, ask each other questions, share successes, share challenges, share resources. And that platform, the room in that platform that I'm going to invite you to, is private to this organization. So we don't sell you anything. We don't collect your data. It's just a room provided to you by us in the hopes that it'll help you work together and work with us. Now, one of the things I'm going to say is that we're not going to send that invitation to you today. And the reason for that is, as soon as I'm done this presentation, I'm on vacation. And if I send you the invitation, then you're going to come and ask questions, or you're going to have a little bit of trouble logging on sometimes. Are you going to share exciting stuff, and I'm going to miss it all. So I'm not going to invite you until I am back on on January 5th. So so it is coming. It's kind of a teaser, and I'm sorry that I'm not inviting you now, but I don't want to be left out, and I don't want to leave you hanging if you have trouble setting up your password or something like that. So I promise I'm going to circulate the link, but it's going to come in January, and I hope you can forgive me for that. Yes, great. Shirley just put in the chat. I put in a much more rudimentary version of the link, and Shirley has put the correct full fancy link. Nativelands.ca is the link to that map, and Nativelands.ca is an organization that is owned and operated by Indigenous people, and it is a fantastic organization. And they have, you can use those maps for free. They have an API. An API is kind of technical. You might not be, if you're not a tech person, an API isn't going to be helpful to you. But our team has taken those maps and embedded them into free downloadable Tableau workbooks. So if you use Tableau, which you can use for free, if you need a free subscription to Tableau, email me, I'll help you get that. That's Tableau Public, like not the fancy Tableau that's like $100,000, but a free organizational Tableau Public. You can have those for free. Okay, I'm done. They made me promise I would end on time, and I have. Oh, and there's a survey link for your evaluation also in the chat. So please take the survey. What we want more than anything is for this stuff to be useful. So anything we can do to make it more useful, be blunt, be specific. And I will turn it back over to anybody. Does anybody want to say anything from the organizing committee, or shall I wish everyone a good winter break?
You made it, Heather. You made it within the time frame. So thank you again for participating. You made it. Thank you again for participating in today's session. Like Heather mentioned, we want your feedback. Betsy has placed a very brief evaluation survey in the chat. It'll take less than 3 minutes. We look forward to seeing you at our next Lunch and Learn on Tuesday, January 12th from 12 to 1 Central to unpack the 2 activities we viewed at the end of the session, brainstorming with a microscope and the puzzle pieces, with an equity lens tuned towards our 3 student subgroups, ELs, students with disabilities, and economically disadvantaged students. And at our next learning community on how to collect and analyze demographics with data on Thursday, January 21st from 3:30 to 4:30 Central. Thank you again and have a wonderful and safe holiday season.
I just want to say a shout out. That was amazing, Heather. Thank you from Papillion La Vista Community Schools. I'm so excited to see more. So thank you, thank you, thank you. Sorry I interrupted. Loved it.
It was awesome. Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
You, Melanie.
Have a great, I know. Thanks for coming, Melanie. Have a great holiday, everyone.